Good evening. I'm Jeff Spence from the Office of Alumni Relations at Thomas Jefferson University, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's presentation. Tonight, our speaker, Hans Hesselein, will share tips and tricks for creating a sustainable home garden, no matter your space. Through tonight's talk, we invite you to share any questions you have using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will address questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. And if you submitted questions in advance, we have received them and shared them with our speaker to be incorporated into tonight's talk. If you don't see the Q&A button, try moving your cursor and it should appear. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Hans Hesselein. Hans is a graduate of North Carolina State University and has spent time working internationally in Germany and in several landscape architecture firms in New York City. He previously served as executive director of the Gowanus Canal Conservancy in Brooklyn, and currently he's the principal at Apiary Studio Landscape Architecture in Philadelphia, and he serves as an adjunct professor in the university's landscape architecture program. Hans, thank you for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. And I'm excited to share some of the tips and tricks that I've learned about home gardening and whether it's vegetable gardening or ornamental gardening. But there's a few things that I've learned over the years, as both as a hobbyist and as a professional, that I'm happy to share with the Jefferson Alumni Network. So thank you everyone for joining me for this lecture. And basically, we're going to cover three themes, or at least this lecture is kind of broken down into three general categories. The first is going to be where to begin, how to start a garden, and that's really going to be focused primarily on vegetable gardening, even though the entire lecture won't just focus on vegetable gardening, but this first section is kind of most germane to vegetable gardening in a yard or on a roof or a stoop. The next section, we're going to talk about different types of gardens and different types of elements that you might want to put in your garden for DIY home projects. And then finally, I'm going to share my top 7 favorite gardening tools and where you can buy some of them. And I've noticed over the years how difficult it can be to find high quality, useful gardening tools. There's a lot of junk on the market, and so I'm excited to tell you guys, based on my professional experience, what I've found has been particularly effective over the years. So where to begin? The first place that you want to start when you're planning a vegetable garden is where you're going to install it. Now, I realize that a lot of the viewers in this lecture are going to be from all kinds of different places and backgrounds. Some people will have a more traditional home with maybe a few thousand square feet or up to several acres of yard to deal with. Other people who are listening to this lecture may only have a stoop or a rooftop because they're living in an apartment in an urban place. A lot of this lecture is going to deal with yards and larger open spaces, but we will also talk about how you can garden in some urban areas. But the first thing that you want to consider is, where are you going to garden? Now, this is going to be applicable. The first rule is you got to have full sun. If you're going to be growing vegetables particularly, you really need a lot of sun. There are few, if any, vegetables that can grow in shade. So whether you have a yard or whether you have an apartment building, wherever you're going to be growing vegetables, you got to have a lot of sun. If you happen to have a yard, you might also want to think about not just where the sunny location is, but also kind of proximity to the kitchen, because you're going to be bringing vegetables and herbs in and out of the house, and you want to quickly get them to the sink so you can wash them after you've harvested. So if you have options beyond just a sunny location, if you can park it somewhere near a kitchen, that's also a good idea. Finally, some people might even have barns or tool sheds and wheelbarrows and hoes and other large gardening elements, maybe a rototiller. You also probably want to site your garden somewhere near where all of your tools and materials are stored. And all these things are just kind of logistical issues that you may need to deal with when you're planning your garden. So, full sun is really important, but also proximity and convenience are other important considerations for planning a garden. After you've selected a site, the next thing you need to do is think about what you're going to grow in your garden and order seeds. Now, we're not too late in the year by any means to start buying seeds and starting seeds, but obviously, if you want to start planning for 2021, you can buy seeds as early as February and start them in March before you start your garden. But for now, it's not too late at all, but you really want to think about what kinds of things are you going to grow in your garden. Some vegetables are easier than others. Leafy greens happen to be really easy, and tomatoes are pretty easy, but then there are more complicated things like radicchio. There are some things that can only be planted in the fall, like garlic. But so for you, when you're planning your garden, you want to think about what kinds of plants do I want to get, and what kinds of seeds do I need to purchase. And fortunately, tomorrow, the alumni office is going to email a handout that we created, which has a bunch of resources listed. I know it's getting really difficult to buy seeds right now. A lot of places are sold out. A lot of local garden centers are sold out, but we have a few, through our experience, we know of a couple of places where you can still get a large number of seeds that aren't totally sold out yet. And so we're going to share some of those websites and local businesses with you in that handout, so you can still order seeds. Do not worry, they're still available. Many types of seeds you can sow directly in the soil, but some of them really want to be sown first in a cell pack or a small container so that you can grow them on. They can develop a small root system, and that way when you put them in the soil, they won't have to compete as much with other weed seeds. Sometimes if you're growing a garden, there we go. Sometimes if you're growing, hopefully you guys can see this slide now. I'm on the third slide. If you're growing plants in a garden that you just cultivated, oftentimes there'll be a lot of weed seed in the soil. Say you tilled under your lawn or something like that. There'll be a lot of grass seed and weed seed that will come up, and it can be hard to distinguish between, let's see here. Yeah, I know. Guys, I'm really sorry. I'm not sharing my Zoom screen. That's the problem. Let's share my screen. How's that? That's good. Great. Sorry about that. So now you can look at more than just my face. Okay. So, like I was saying, some plants want to be started in cell trays. You can get cell trays, obviously from last year's crop, or you can buy them at a local garden center, or you can even order them online at Amazon or your favorite online gardening resource. But some plants want to be started in cell trays. This is particularly useful next year if you're starting to germinate your plants in March or February before you can really put them in the ground because of risks of frost. You can get a really good head start by starting them early in cell trays or small containers. Let's see here. Some seeds can be grown directly in the ground very easily, like beets and carrots and other root vegetables are really easy to start in the ground. But things like lettuce and squash, beans, those are really great candidates for starting in cell trays ahead of time. And beans in particular will grow so fast, it's really easy to do it this way. If you're gonna start plants indoors, particularly in the colder months, in order to get a head start on planting when it warms up, it can be really great to buy inexpensive grow lights. We bought these on Amazon, and they're LED grow lights, so they consume very little energy. They have really powerful outputs, and it makes a huge difference because the amount of light coming in your window, especially if you don't have a southern facing apartment or room of the house, you can really suffer from lack of light. And so grow lights really can make a huge difference in getting your seedlings bulked up and prepped before they go outdoors. So consider getting a grow light and setting up an informal operation somewhere in your house. And it doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. Another thing that you're going to need if you're going to be growing seedlings in cell trays or ahead of time, you're going to need some kind of growing media, because what you and I think of as dirt or regular soil from outdoors, that is not appropriate for growing plants in containers or starting seeds inside. Most growing media or soilless plant media is made out of peat, which is sphagnum moss, which grows way up in northern climates in bogs and is like really deep and is harvested for this purpose. It has really great moisture retaining properties. A lot of people argue that peat is not a sustainable resource. And so there's a new material emerging in the horticulture industry called coir, which is made out of crushed and ground up coconut husks. And that is definitely a sustainable and renewable resource. So if you want to be super green and not use peat, you might use a coir-based growing media, COIR, which is basically a recycled product from the coconut industry. Most growing medias also, it's really a tricky balance between holding water, but also letting the water drain freely, because plant roots need to respire and absorb oxygen from the air and the soil. So most growing medias are made out of coir or peat, which holds water, but then there's also a mineral in there, which is usually expanded vermiculite or perlite, which gives some texture and lightness to the soil and allows water to drain through it quickly. So you need to have, the best growing medias have a balance between water absorption and water drainage. And those often have, you see those little white pebbles in there are expanded perlite, which is a really great material in most good growing mediums. When you're starting seeds, sometimes you'll buy growing media that has fertilizer already kind of mixed into it. A lot of Miracle-Gro potting soil will have fertilizer already baked in, because Miracle-Gro is first and foremost a fertilizer company. But then like the examples of the growing media that I showed you, none of these actually have any nutrients in it at all. And so you need to supplement with some kind of fertilizer. Now, chemical fertilizers are really powerful, and I won't judge anybody for using chemical fertilizers, but that makes a fair number of people uncomfortable, and a lot of people are starting to go more organic these days. And so there are things you can use, materials that have really great fertilization properties that are more organic. So things like fish emulsion and bone and blood meal have a lot of nutrients that plants love, but some of you may be vegan and uncomfortable with using animal byproducts to help fertilize your plants, in which case things like kelp liquid and seaweed liquid, which are intended as fertilizer, will go a long way to helping your plants. Notice in the bottle that I'm showing you here, where it says fish fertilizer, there's a 5-1-1 at the bottom. That is the ratio of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in the fertilizer. And that is basically those three elements, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the elements, the macronutrients that plants really need to grow and thrive. There are also a lot of micronutrients that plants need, but we're not going to get into that because that is really complicated stuff. But essentially, you want to look at those three numbers on the fertilizer that you're purchasing, the NPK ratios, and that's really what's going to give your plants the best boost when you try to grow them. Somebody did ask ahead of time, what kinds of things can you do to help increase the yield of fruiting vegetables like tomatoes and peppers? Tomatoes in particular are a little funny. They absolutely need sources of calcium. That's a micronutrient that they need. You can get bloom end rot on your tomatoes if you don't have enough calcium in your soil or your media. And so crushed eggshells or a micronutrient supplement that has calcium in it can be really critical for making sure that your tomatoes don't rot on the vine. pardon the pun. But fertilizer is really critical, essentially, to helping boost your plants and making sure that you really get really good fruit production. If you're going to be vegetable gardening year after year, you also want to rotate your crops. You don't want to grow tomatoes and peppers in the same place you did last year. Same thing with beans. You want to kind of move them around the garden. You guys have probably heard of crop rotation. The same thing applies to vegetable gardening, because otherwise you can get nutrients deficiencies, because different plants absorb different things at different rates. So you want to keep mixing them around so that they, you generally kind of absorb the nutrients equally throughout the garden, but also they can leave pests and diseases behind. And so you generally don't want to grow the same type of plant in the same location 2 years in a row. So after you've selected your plants, you bought your soil media, you've got your fertilizer, and you've started your seeds, the next thing you need to do is start to clear the plot that you're going to be growing in. If you have a big yard, you might want to rent a rototiller at a local garden center or hardware store, or some of you may already own one, but a rototiller is a very handy tool, which makes quite short work of clearing a plot to grow a garden in. So that's something that you want to do if you happen to have land. You want to clear a plot. And it helps ahead of time for you to think, how many plants do I really want to grow? Do I want a small garden because I just want to have some salad greens or a few tomato plants? I really can't handle the amount of maintenance burden that a large garden is going to create. Or do I want to shoot the moon, and do I want to grow a 1/4 acre plot and feed the entire neighborhood with my plants? But thinking ahead of time about the quantity of plants you want to grow and the amount of labor that you're willing to invest in your garden will help to determine the size of your plot. Some of you will not have a large yard that you can grow vegetables in, and so you may be confined to a smaller space, in which case raised beds can be a really great thing. They're small, they can be very attractive, and it also allows you to more easily access the plants, because you can walk all around. I would say if you're going to be building raised beds, they shouldn't be wider than 4 feet, because you can generally reach about 2 feet into the garden from any side. And so 4 feet wide and however many feet long is a good rule of thumb for a raised bed. And I would say no higher than 2 feet. Generally 12 to 18 inches high is a good height for a raised bed. Another thing that's good about raised beds is that you're generally not walking on the garden soil, so you don't compact it, which means you don't have to rototill it year after year after year. And so the soil stays nice and airy, which is easy for plant roots to grow in. It also allows water to percolate into the soil really quickly. And finally, some of you will be living in, might have a yard where you have concerns about soil contamination. Maybe there's a lot of lead in the soil. Raised beds allow you to separate new garden soil, which you fill in the raised bed, from the existing contaminated soil. And that's another reason why raised beds are very popular in urban areas. Some materials that you can make raised beds out of, the least expensive and quickest to get is probably just regular wood, spruce, pine, fir that you would get at a hardware store. That's only going to last you about 2 to 3 years before it rots and you need to replace the boards. A more durable wood that can handle soil contact would be cedar. It's a bit more expensive, but it'll last for maybe up to 10 years with soil contact. And then there are some really durable woods like black locust, which is a sustainably harvested local hardwood species. Very difficult to find, not inexpensive, but black locust is an amazing, durable, really it'll almost outlast you in the soil. Black locust can be a really great product. You can also buy corrugated metal kits, which you can order from garden centers or possibly even online, these prefabricated garden kits. And some people might even want to get really creative and find ways of putting stone together to hold raised beds. Other options include cinder block, which are pretty inexpensive, but not everybody is a fan of the look of cinder block. They're inexpensive, as I said, but it's a pretty laborious, intensive process of assembling a cinder block raised bed. Board form concrete, for all you brutalist architects listening to the lecture today, board form concrete is a beautiful, modern, aesthetic material. It's a lot of work though, a whole lot of work to build that. Not cheap. Corten steel, another really kind of trendy, high-end material for raised beds outside of buildings, especially in urban areas. We've designed a couple of ornamental gardens with Corten steel raised beds, not for vegetables, but for ornamental gardening. This is very expensive, so probably not really practical for most people, but you know, it's a metal that happens to rust. That's the aesthetic. And then that patina protects the metal inside from further degradation. And finally, brick. Brick can be a wonderful material for a low raised bed or a high raised bed. It can just form a nice edge to your garden. And you can even, if you're living in Philadelphia, many of you have probably seen plenty of discarded bricks around the city. They're easy to find. You can also even buy new or used ones. I went to a Mason supply store in Mount Holly, New Jersey a couple of years ago and was able to buy recycled Philly brick for $1 a piece, which is pretty cheap. Not always easy to find if you're buying it, but that can be an option too. Other raised bed options, these are more like containers than raised beds. These are things that if you're working in an even smaller, more confined space, these can work. This isn't like a stoop garden. This might be just a small backyard or small front yard. Things like you can use corrugated plastic pipe that you would cut into sections and grow plants in that. That can be an interesting kind of innovative material. Reused black plastic nursery pots can work. You can buy sewn felt bags to grow plants in. Those are pretty inexpensive. And for some of the fashion alumni on the call, this might be a really fun project for you to go out and buy some kind of felted synthetic product and sew your own interesting garden bags for use in the garden. So that's an option. And then what's something that's become really popular lately is using these galvanized stock tanks, which you can buy at an Agway or a tractor supply store. They'll last for years in the garden. They're pretty lightweight. You just need a truck or a minivan or a car with a large folding down back seat in order to get them home. But these galvanized stock tanks also make quick, easy raised beds, particularly for urban situations. And I think they're pretty attractive. You know, it's a particular kind of aesthetic. For some people, that still is going to take up too much room. Maybe you only have a windowsill or a stoop in front of your apartment building, or just a small landing in front of the front door. In that case, you can grow plants in pots. Now, the size of the pot is really going to limit the size of the plant you grow. So you're never going to get a huge squash crop or a watermelon crop out of a pot. But herbs can do very well in pots, particularly hardy Mediterranean herbs. One thing about pots is that they are going to dry out really fast, particularly if you're using terracotta, because it's a porous material. Wind and sun will allow water to wick through the terracotta and evaporate out into the air. So you got to watch these plants like a hawk and water them absolutely every day, possibly multiple times a day, especially if they're in full sun. But pots can be really good for particularly for herbs. And what I really like about pots, or the most attractive pot gardens that I see, use profusions of pots, lots of them. They look great in a mass. Even when they're kind of messy, like in this image in the upper left-hand corner where this guy has lots of different kinds of materials together, what makes it attractive and what makes that composition work is that there's so many of them being used in the same place at the same time. Some of you might want to do some DIY projects. You don't have a lot of room, but you want to do something creative and make your own pots. Concrete is a wonderful material to use. It will take on the form of whatever you pour it into. In the upper left-hand corner here, you see these small containers that were made, one out of a bubble wrap form, which looks really cool. You can use yogurt containers. But then there's another method that a lot of alpine gardeners use called hypertufa, which uses, you don't buy concrete, you just buy the Portland cement. And you mix Portland cement with something lightweight like peat or perlite usually, and use a very low water ratio to it. And you kind of smush, you take this like really coarse mix of Portland cement and whatever your aggregate, lightweight aggregate is, and you kind of smush it into your form. And it's really rustic and rough looking. It drains freely, and that can be, an interesting material to use for container gardening. The most important thing that you have to remember if you're growing any plants, whether it's herbs, vegetables, whatever, if you're growing anything in a container, it has to have holes in the bottom. And that definitely applies to the stock tanks, because you're going to need to drill holes in those if you're going to grow plants. If you don't have holes in the bottom of your pot, it will not drain and your plants will drown. They will suffocate in their own water in those pots. So they have to drain. Do not forget that. And then finally, using recycled materials, found bins or bulb crates, or milk crates that you could find outside a dumpster at the supermarket. All those things can make wonderful containers, and there's a particular kind of DIY recycled aesthetic that goes along with that. If you're going to be using milk crates or something that's really porous like that, you're probably going to need to sew or make some kind of fabric bag to slide down inside it so the soil doesn't go pouring out of the sides. But these types of containers can be really wonderful. And again, just like the terracotta pot examples I showed you earlier, these look best when you do lots of them together to create a composition. One or two recycled Rubbermaid containers in front of your apartment might look a little trashy, but if you've got a dozen of them or 6 or something like that, and it looks more intentional and more kind of creative, it's going to look a whole lot more attractive. And then finally, there's some images here on the right of, this was a project we did in Fishtown, where we came across these discarded fiberglass water tanks. We cut the tops off and drilled holes in the bottom. And this was a really cool temporary DIY planter. So if it will hold soil, it can be used to grow plants in. For those of you that are working on a budget or in a confined space, or really just like the recycled look. When you're growing plants in a garden, it is critical to think about water. How far away is your garden going to be from water? Do you have any access to water? It does not make sense to, if say you're starting a guerrilla garden on a vacant lot in Philadelphia, something that I'll talk a little bit more about later, and you get really ambitious and you rototill up a huge patch of land and you start a garden, if you don't have access to water, it's going to get old really quickly carrying buckets of water from your house to the garden. But your plants need to be watered, and vegetables, you can't just let them go like you can with some ornamental crops. Your vegetables need to be watered. So think about that. Access to water and the source of water is going to be really critical. If you don't have easy access to water, if you have to hike up and down stairs to get it, you might want to make sure that you're just growing something very modest in pots, in which case, a watering can would be sufficient. But other source of watering in a garden might be these oscillating sprinklers or an impact sprinkler if you have a yard, or even just watering by hand with a watering wand. Those are all perfectly suitable ways to water your plants, but water is critical. Now, some people on this call are probably really, techie geeks who love to do really complicated DIY projects, in which case doing drip irrigation can be a really great solution to watering your garden. Drip irrigation materials, you can order them online, even off of Amazon. I'm sorry, I keep plugging Amazon. It's just so ubiquitous and easy these days. But you can also order them from other sources. But drip irrigation components are really inexpensive. It's just kind of complicated assembling the system. But there are things as simple as drip tape or drip tube. There are drip emitters. But hooking up a system like that and putting it on what they call a clock or a timer that you hook up to your hose bib allows you to basically install the garden, wash your hands, and walk away from it. And if you have it on a timer where it's watering once a day or every other day, it can save you a whole lot of labor later on in the process. But you also have to be pretty technically inclined in order to undertake a project like that. YouTube has lots of great instructional videos. So next thing I want to talk about is mulch. Mulch is really important in vegetable gardens. There are 3 principal reasons. First, the mulch helps suppress weeds. If you're working in if you're bringing in your own fresh potting media, you don't have to worry about weeds because those things are always weed free and they're really clean if you bought soil or you bought potting media. However, if you're rototilling soil in your backyard, there's going to be a ton of grass and weed seeds in that soil, and you're just going to be constantly doing battle with it. So mulch really helps to suppress weed seeds, which will compete with your plants. It also helps to shade the soil and prevent water from evaporating due to sun and wind, so it keeps your plants moist longer. so it reduces the amount of water you have to put on it. And then finally, also, it helps to reduce erosion. Whenever you water your garden or whenever it rains, if you don't have mulch on your garden, some of the soil is going to wash away. And there are a lot of really great mulch products out there that you can use. Salt hay is one of our favorites. It's locally sourced along the East Coast. It is like not totally weed free. It's actually grown in salt marshes along the coast. It's a really interesting and unusual historic product, which you can look up online. Straw is another good resource. We're all familiar with straw bales. You can buy straw pretty easily and spread it out on the garden. Wood chips can be good, but generally speaking, if you're not using already decomposed shredded mulch, you're using fresh wood chips, you need to let them sit for a year before you put them on your garden, because as wood chips decompose, the fungus, which are breaking them down, actually absorb a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So you don't generally want to put fresh wood chips on your vegetable garden. Gravel is a durable, attractive, but heavy and more expensive mulch product, but we really like gravel, and that can be a great thing to use on your garden. One trick I want to share with you, if I encourage you to use mulch on your garden for the 3 reasons I already shared, but if you're going to mulch your garden, I recommend you mulch first, and then you plug your plants into it. If you're growing from seed, that's a different story, because you can't have mulch on top of your seeds. But if you're putting plugs and cell packs into the garden, it's a lot easier to put the mulch down first and then spread it a little bit and put the plug into the soil. Trying to mulch after you've already installed your tiny little seedlings is going to really be a frustrating process, because you can end up smothering or breaking them in the process, and it's just much more difficult. So mulch first, plant second, generally, is my recommendation. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about different types of gardens and garden elements that you might want to include in your vegetable garden or your ornamental garden. And these are some images that we've seen over the years that I think are interesting. So tomatoes. A lot of you really want to grow tomatoes, either for cherry tomatoes for salad, San Marzano and Roma tomatoes for canning and making sauce, or maybe you just want to grow big, juicy mortgage or zebra tomatoes for your sandwiches. In any case, if you're growing tomatoes, you've got to trellis them in some way, because those plants produce such an abundance of fruit. They are going to weigh themselves down and they're going to crash over. Sometimes they'll even break and die because of the weight of their own tomatoes. You've got to trellis them somehow, whether it's with a fence, whether it's with a cage, or whether it's doing this thing called the weave, where you can see in this image, we've got stakes intermittently, maybe every 6 feet, and then they draw strings between the stakes, and as the tomatoes grow up higher and higher, you'll draw the next line of string and you'll tie it off to the stakes, and that basically catches the tomatoes and prevents them from falling over on either side. The tomato weave, you can see videos of how to do it on YouTube. It's really best if you're growing like a whole bunch of tomatoes in a long line. This is what farmers do. But if you're just growing a couple of tomatoes, a cage is the best thing. You can do a DIY kind of wood cage or a metal cage from materials that you have around the house or buy, or you can just buy those standard round tomato cages, which are easy to get at any hardware store or garden center. Other things that need to have some kind of structure to grow up, almost all peas and pole beans need something to climb. So you want to use maybe a mesh strung between sticks. Maybe you want to create some interesting structure. It could be rustic, like this bean pole structure at Monticello, where they have this superstructure, this framework of wooden beams, and then you can see these strings hanging down, which the vines will twine and grow up to the top. And then that's easy to harvest. It gives them access to lots of sun. These bean poles at Monticello are another example. You would plant the beans at the base and they would twine their way up the top of the teepee. Or you can do something really rustic and funky and just stick a bunch of stakes and sticks in the ground, and the beans and peas will find their way and grow up that. You know, it's kind of a little bit more of a messy look than some of these other methods, but it'll work. But beans, pole beans anyway, not bush beans, pole beans, peas, cucumbers and some kinds of squash definitely need some kind of structure to grow up. A garden fence can be important. We had to put a garden fence around our garden mainly to keep our dog from running through the garden. But garden fences are really important in suburban and rural areas because of critters, mostly rabbits. They won't keep squirrels and chipmunks out, but rabbits and your dogs and cats can be a real problem in your garden. So fences can be really useful, but they also provide a structure for either lashing tomatoes to or beans and peas to grow up. So they serve a dual purpose of protecting the garden, but also providing something for plants to grow on. Cold frames can be really fun if you're making a long-term investment in your vegetable garden. Cold frames are great because they're sunken down in the soil. They act as a greenhouse, so there'd be a glass or a clear plastic lid on top. And so they absorb sunlight and heat during the day. And because they're down deeper into the soil, maybe 2 feet deep, they absorb some of the warmth from the soil, and they generally stay about 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the air above them. So if you're trying to start plants in March, even at the end of February, if you start your plants in a cold frame, that can allow you to get up to a month head start on growing plants out in the garden. So that can be also a really attractive and fun project for your home garden. Another thing that you might consider is these types of meshes, which can be used for growing, maybe you just want to do cut flowers in your garden. A mesh like this can be really useful. This is an image from a florist or a floriculture farm where they're growing cut flowers commercially. But a lot of cut flowers, particularly peonies and dahlias and things with really big, heavy flowers, are bred to the point where they get so heavy the plant can collapse. And so you may need a mesh to support some of your flowers in a garden. I threw this slide in here just for fun. This is for those of you that are super crunchy. This might be a fun project. It's called Horticulturist. You can look it up. It's developed in Germany. The idea here is that you dig a trench, you fill it with wood and sticks, and then you cover it with soil. And over time, fungi and bacteria are going to break that wood down in the soil underneath the garden, and it's going to release the nutrients that were stored in that wood. And the plants that you install on top of it, their roots will go down and they'll absorb the nutrients that are released by the wood. It's not for everybody. It's kind of funny, but it can be a very kind of permaculture way to grow plants and fertilize them essentially without actually using chemical fertilizers. Okay, some of you may want to make a long-term investment in growing fruits in your yard. This is obviously not going to work very well for the apartment dwellers on the call, but starting an orchard in your yard can be really great. Apples and pears are very common, but they also have a lot of pests. Somebody asked ahead of time, what can I do to make sure that my apples and pears produce a lot of really great fruit? Well, one of the problems with growing fruit trees, or one of the challenges with them, is that they attract so many pests that you really cannot grow blemish-free fruit if you're unwilling to spray them. Now, spraying does not mean you have to use some horrible toxic chemical. There are lots of organic sprays on the market that will help to keep pests down and keep the blemishes off your fruit, but spraying of some kind is going to be necessary in order to keep pests off your apples and pears. Now, if you're just going to be baking your apples, or you're just going to be making applesauce, it doesn't matter how many blemishes are on them from insects that are, biting them and sticking their proboscis in them and causing scarring. That doesn't matter if you're baking or making applesauce. And so you can just grow fruit trees in your backyard without worrying about it, and then just harvest the fruit ugly and everything and bake with them. Some plants have fewer pests. I think sour cherries are wonderful. My favorite type of pie is cherry pie. So the first fruit tree we planted in our yard was a sour cherry. They don't need another pollinator. You can grow a single sour cherry and it'll produce a ton of fruit in a couple of years, and they don't have as many pests. And so we don't spray ours. We just have to kind of make sure that when the fruit lands on the ground, you clean it up quickly, because that's when pests will start to develop if you let a lot of fruit rot on the ground underneath the tree. Apricots are another pretty easy tree that you can grow that doesn't have a ton of pests. And what's wonderful about all these fruit trees is not only do you get great fruit in the late summer, but also you have this wonderful spring display of profusions of flowers. So they're beautiful in the spring when they're in bloom, and then you get lots of fruit. Somebody asks, how do I get my plum tree to produce lots of fruit? Year after year it blooms, then it rains and the flowers drop off and I never get any fruit. It's probably not the rain, actually. Plums, one of the challenges with plums is that they're some of the earliest flowering trees that we can grow around here. And oftentimes they'll get hit with a really late frost. We had a couple of really late frosts in early May this year, long after the plums had finished blooming. And any frost that hits these fruit trees is going to zap the flower bud or zap the juvenile fruit, and you're going to lose your whole crop. And so plums are a particular challenge for that reason. Now, some people might want to grow fruit trees in a backyard, but they don't have a lot of space. And espalier is a great method to conserve space in a garden and also be able to grow fruit. And so this is traditionally done by lashing a tree up against a fence or a structure of some kind, and carefully training the branches up against it with wires or little twisty ties that you secure to the masonry or the fence. And basically you're torturing the plant doesn't mind at all, but you're kind of lashing it to the structure, and that allows you to kind of use up a whole lot less space and still get really great fruit production. One warning about espalier: it takes a whole lot of skill. I've never actually attempted it. It takes a lot of skill and practice, and so you can learn about how to do it on YouTube, but it's not an easy thing to do. Some people may not have a lot of space, don't want to espalier. There are fruiting shrubs out there. Everybody's familiar with raspberries. They're great, delicious. The trick about raspberries, there are ever-bearing kinds, and there are some that only bear once at the beginning of the year. You want to read carefully about the pruning regimen for raspberries, because they do need to be pruned every year, but it's really critical, the timing of the pruning, so that you can make sure that you get good fruit set the next year. So raspberries need some kind of pruning regime every year, and then also generally you want some kind of structure to hold them in, because otherwise, you know, they're thorny. They're going to be sending these whips out all over the yard, and you're going to scratch yourself like crazy if you don't contain them with some kind of structure. Flowering quince can be really nice. They're beautiful, beautiful flowers in the early spring. They don't get affected by frost all that much. Problem with quince is that you definitely do not eat that fruit raw. That is really only for baking or for jellies and jams, which is a whole nother topic that we're not going to get into, but quince jam and quince jelly are wonderful, but you really have to be willing to invest the time and energy. Figs are probably the most foolproof thing you can grow. They're easy, easy, easy. Some of them will produce 2 crops during the year. Usually they'll produce them in the early summer. Figs are easy, but climatic considerations are really important. If you live in upstate New York or in Saskatchewan or something like that, figs probably aren't going to be good for you. They're a very tender crop. But if you're living in Philadelphia or in an urban area, where the temperatures are warmer and springs are milder, figs are great and they're foolproof. You want to they need full sun, and you want to tend to plant them near a wall or near a house or near a building, something that's going to absorb heat in the winter and then radiate it back out, which is going to help the figs stay alive, essentially. And then finally, blueberries. Blueberries are wonderful. They're actually native plants. They have beautiful fall color. Who doesn't love blueberry fruit? They need full sun. That's something that, well, actually they don't need full sun. They'll produce more fruit in full sun, but this is one of the only fruit crops that can actually handle shade. It's just gonna, the shadier the environment, the less fruit it's gonna produce. But one critical thing about blueberries is that you need at least 2 different kinds in order to pollinate each other to get fruit set. If you have 1 blueberry or 2 blueberries that are the same kind, you're not gonna get good fruit set. Now, some people just aren't going to grow a lot of vegetables, so maybe they want to grow herbs. Herbs can be a wonderful thing, and it can save you a lot of money from grocery shopping. I know herbs are really expensive. Sometimes I can spend $3 on a bunch of herbs, but thyme, oregano, rosemary, sage, these are all perennials, meaning they'll come back year after year. They can live in pots, and they can save you a lot of money, and they can be very satisfying and attractive. Other herbs include dill or fennel or parsley. What's a double great thing about them is not only are they good to eat, but also swallowtail caterpillars love to eat anything in the carrot family. So that's dill, fennel, parsley, carrots, and you will definitely get swallowtail caterpillars on them, which will eventually become big yellow and black, bold butterflies. Chives do not produce, there's no caterpillar that eats chives, but they're also a great herb you can grow, and they're perennial. Some people want to grow cut flowers in a garden. That could be another thing. Maybe you don't want to grow vegetables. You find them boring. I don't know. But cut flower gardening can be a wonderful way to garden at home. And also growing perennials and plants that will come back year after year can be a great way to provide habitat for animals, particularly pollinators, bees, caterpillars, butterflies, and moths, which then in turn feed birds. Birds depend on caterpillars in order to feed their young. So some birds will eat a lot of seed, but if they're feeding their young, it's always caterpillars or other forms of insects, which is why it's particularly important to grow native plants which feed our native butterfly caterpillars. And that will help enhance the bird population in your community. Composting, some people want to compost. I generally recommend a 3-bin system. It allows you to fill the first bin with fresh compost. Once it gets to the top, you then fork it out, put it in the second bin, and allow it to cure. And then finally, the third bin is ready compost that's ready to go. Each time you fill a bin, you move it on down the line, and that helps to mix and break it down. And once the compost has finally gotten into the third bin, then it's ready for use in your garden. You can build compost bins out of recycled wood or new wood, and it can take on all different kinds of aesthetics. Insect hotels. Maybe you don't want to garden at all, but you really want to create some kind of naturalist project in your yard for your kids or just for yourself. Creating an insect hotel with lots of different materials can be a wonderful way to attract more wildlife, particularly insects and birds, to your garden. The critical thing about these is having lots of nooks and crannies for bugs to live in. Wood with holes drilled in the end will attract mason bees, which need to drill into wood to lay their eggs, and their larvae will actually colonize that wood and emerge, and then that's a great native pollinator, which will then go around and pollinate your fruit and vegetable crops or other native plants or ornamental plants you have in the garden. And insect hotels can take on all kinds of interesting creative forms made out of recycled materials or new materials, but there are all kinds of things you can do. Now, sorry I'm speeding through this. I made too many slides. The last section I want to talk about, favorite tools. There are 7 of them. The most critical thing that you need to have as a gardener is a good pair of pruners. The top brand that I recommend is called Felco, is the Felco number 2 model. They make 13 different kinds of pruners, but the number 2 is the best one. They're not cheap. They're about $50, but this is hands down the best pruner on the market, and all professional horticulturists are using Felco pruners. They're made in Switzerland. They're awesome, and I cannot recommend them more strongly enough. The second most important tool that you can have in your home gardening collection is a soil knife. I prefer them over trowels. A soil knife will not bend or break. I am constantly, well, I used to use trowels. I don't use them anymore, but I would constantly bend the neck whenever I try to pry a dandelion or a tap-rooted plant out of the soil. Never with a soil knife. You won't break it, and you can use them in the same way you would a trowel to plant plugs or things out of your cell trays into the garden. So a soil knife is far superior to a trowel, in my opinion, and they're not very expensive. Spades, I think it's critical to have a good spade. My favorite spade is a rabbiting spade, this curved, rounded spade you see in the middle. It's perfect for planting perennials and smaller plants. The best one that you can find online is made by Clarendon Forge in England. Not cheap, but it'll last you a lifetime. Another type of spade, I have both, of course. You don't need both necessarily, but a flat spade can be good for, is better for installing shrubs and trees. And also you need a flat spade if you're going to be cutting a nice clean edge along the edge of your garden. Clarendon Forge makes a nice garden flat spade, but also if you want something a little less expensive, Jackson is a domestic brand that makes a nice spade as well. Make sure it is forged and not stamped metal, because forged metal is a lot more rigid. Stamped metal spades will sometimes bend even under if you're trying to pry soil, and that is no good. Wooden handles also I prefer over metal or plastic. This next tool, loppers, if you have shrubs with 3-inch limbs or smaller, this particular lopper, it's called the Fiskar Power Gear Bypass Lopper. You can get them at Home Depot. If I can fit it in the blade, I can cut it. And these things are amazing how powerful they are. They don't even have to be super sharp, but they will cut through 3-inch or smaller diameter limbs. Really, really useful. A gamma hoe, this is a Japanese gardening tool. You can order these off Amazon or other online marketplaces. This is really useful for shallow rooted weeds. It's like a small hoe. You scratch the surface of the soil and it eliminates weeds once they're starting. It's not great for big established weeds, but it's great for small weeds when you get them just as they're starting to germinate. Spring rake, really good for cleaning up or removing debris from freshly tilled soil or raking underneath shrubs. Hand rake for small, tight gardening spaces. And then finally, pruning saws. A really nice sharp pruning saw is critical if you have trees or shrubs in your backyard you need to cut. Again, Felco, the Swiss company, makes the best pruning saw. Very expensive, about $50. But you can also get a $20 folding saw at your local Home Depot or Lowe's made by Corona, which is also very good. It's not quite as fancy as the Felco, but it's also a really, really good sharp pruning saw. So that's my presentation. Jeff, we've got a couple of minutes left. I think you might have some questions that maybe people posed.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
Thank you so much, Hans. This was an extremely informative presentation and really, really great information shared with everyone. For our attendees, I'll assure you that we will be sending you tomorrow in your email the resource sheet that Hans mentioned, as well as a recording of this presentation will be available on our Alumni YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go back and reference any of the important information that was shared. I think we do have time for probably 1 or 2 questions, and we've received a number. If we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll share them with Hans and we will respond to you via email tomorrow.
Okay.
One of the questions is, and a few questions are actually related to pests. You talked about organic pesticides or organic sprays for fruit plants, but do you have any other organic tips for keeping away bugs and chipmunks in home gardens in general?
Chipmunks, I haven't solved that one yet, unfortunately. So I can't answer that. Chipmunks and squirrels are a perennial problem for me as well. Different pests have different things that will keep them away. There are things called diatomaceous earth, which is, I think, one of the better generalist ways to deal with, organically to deal with pests. Diatomaceous earth is essentially really fine clay, which you would spread on the dust on the leaves of your plants. Anything that crunches and chews on leaves, the diatomaceous earth prevents insects from chewing on leaves, but you just wash it off in your sink when you rinse your garden vegetables before you eat them anyway. So it's totally safe for you to eat the vegetable, and it will help reduce pests, but not all of them.
Another question that I think a lot of folks want to know is, they've really enjoyed this presentation. They're wondering how they might be able to contact you or follow you on social media.
Okay, we do have a social media account. We're on Instagram. So just look up Apiary Studio on Instagram and you can find us. And then my email and my website are listed in the bottom of this slide. You're welcome to email me with any questions and we'll do our best to get back to you. But yeah, I welcome any thoughts or comments or questions. I'd love to help anybody get into gardening if they're thinking about it. So please ask away, and yeah, check out our Instagram account.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much, Hans. This was a really wonderful presentation. For our attendees, we will get to your questions. We'll share them with Hans and get his replies, and we'll send them out to you. You'll also, again, see the recording tomorrow. We hope that you will also join us for some of our other upcoming alumni events, which you can find at jefferson.edu/alumni events. Next week, our textile design department will offer 5 webinars from Monday through Friday, 4 to 5. talking about textile design from alumni, faculty, and students. And then on Monday, June 8th, Dr. Matthew Keller, a dermatologist, will present Don't Get Burned, a guide to skincare, where we'll examine skincare, skin health, and the effects of the summer sun. We also ask you to consider supporting Jefferson students in all departments and colleges and schools. During this challenging time, we'll be calling on our alumni and benefactors to help us reimagine the way we educate tomorrow's leaders by helping generate additional funding to provide financial assistance, which will be increasingly exacerbated following the COVID-19 crisis. You can have a lasting impact on students by visiting giving.jefferson.edu. And for that, thank you. Thank you again, Hans, and thank you all for attending. Be safe and be well.